everybody, welcome to the most scuffed tournament tactician that I've ever done. Now this is going to be scuffed for a few reasons. Number one, this is the first video that I'm shooting on my new computer that I built, so the settings might not be exactly right. I had to re-download a bunch of software. I switched from Streamlabs OBS to normal OBS. Number two, I am coming back from a pretty extended hiatus from LOR, so I'm really kind of new to the meta, reevaluating everything, getting my information all caught up, and that means that normally I would come back in and I'd do a bunch of research over like matchup charts, but I didn't do that this time because this tier list is only good for 5 days. On January 5th, we get a balance patch, which presumably is going to shake a lot of things up. So I don't have the knowledge base that I normally do, or I didn't do all the research that I normally would have done coming back from a vacation because this is only good for one weekend. And then next weekend I'll have a much better idea. You know, I'll redo the research as we get into the balance patch. But for now, let's get into the tier list, right? That's why everybody's here. You don't want to hear me ramble. I'll have some preambles at the end. But for now, let's do the normal tournament tactician thing. So like I mentioned, because I don't have specific matchup chart knowledge, I'm really just going to be giving you a basic overview of the tier list. And the first thing that you're going to notice is that tier 1 is pretty small. It only contains Twisted Fate Nami and Ahri decks. This is the Shurima Ahri Kennen with Absolver, and this is the Flame Chompers Ahri Alulu. I feel as though the two Ahri decks are pretty comparable in power level. It's just a matter of which Ahri deck do you want to run. Now the reason that these are the only decks in tier 1 is because I cannot fathom a lineup, maybe triple aggro does, I don't really know, but I cannot fathom a standard lineup where you are running, where you come across these two decks on your opponent's side and you don't ban one of them, where you ban the third deck, whatever it may be. I think you are always banning one of these two decks, and nothing else is really coming close to them in power level. For the XYZ gamers, the mystery of the format is you start at these two, and then what is the third deck that I'm running? My assumption is that you're just going to be looking for a solid third deck to round out your lineup. I imagine people are going to default onto Plunder, but I've been away from the scene for about 2 weeks, so maybe Plunder is off the rails. I saw that it's not performing as well on ladder as it used to. Maybe we've found a new default. Maybe there is no default. Maybe everybody's switching up. Maybe it's just a preference thing. We'll see Bandletree. We'll see the Pantheon decks. We'll see Dragons, the Thralls, whatever. But I do think that these are sort of the two very solid decks that everybody's going to be using as their starting point. You are looking to ban one of these and then play against the other one. And it feels like there's nothing that really like stomps either of these, even if you are playing aggro. And I mean like aggro, not so much burn. You're going to run into the problem where like TF Nami has a pretty good early game if they can open like Otterpuss into Double Trouble. That is a lot for you to try to chew through with your units, and obviously they're going to have much more refill than you are, and they're already up a card because they Double Troubled, whereas you probably summoned 2 1-drops into it. So I think that like it has a very solid aggro matchup, and then the Ahri decks are running an insane amount of 1-drops as well. You know, they have okay trading power because there's not a lot of 1-drops that aggro is playing that have 2 health. A lot of them are just going for the 1 health. Maybe that's where Spiders comes in because they have like the Arachnoid Horror and the Elise, and you can get over these 1-drops. And maybe that's why Spiders has picked up a higher presence than it has in recent memory. But I think finding 3 aggro decks that perform well against these is going to be a little bit more difficult. So that's why these are sort of the hard stuck tier 1, nothing else comes close decks, and why I've put them in a league of their own. They're not tier 0 by any means, but they are definitely very strong, and I wanted to highlight that by removing everything else out of tier 1 and saying you are below these two. Now, in Tier 2, we really just have sort of the meta staples, the things that I expect to be the third deck that is rounding out these lineups. Thralls, of course, has been very solid for a very long time. Sivir Demacia, another one. Bandletree really found its footing with the new Kennen tech and a couple of other things. So Bandletree still doing very well. These 3 known factors, doing pretty well. Faded. We've moved away from Taric Pantheon to Mono Pantheon, still some Shyvana Pantheon, still some Taric Pantheon. If I had to tier specifically just the Faded decks, I would say Mono Pantheon's number 1, followed by Shyvana Pantheon, followed by Taric Pantheon. Not super confident in 1 and 2, but pretty confident in number 3. Now, I like the Pantheon decks, but especially when you're going for the Mono Pantheon, you are going to eventually run into a hand where you just have 10 combat tricks and you can't play the game like we used to with standalone Fiora. That's the vibes that I get from this deck, which means it's good, and it has some very explosive potential, but you will eventually run into at least one game where you have that consistency issue regardless of how you mulligan, and it's going to feel very bad when you do, and that's why I generally don't recommend this deck to people, because I know how bad it feels to get that one hand one time. It doesn't matter if you were on a 20-0 streak. You run into that one hand, you feel like an idiot. And in a tournament, because the top cut is going to be single elimination, if that hand comes in top cut, you might have XO'd the Swiss rounds, but you'll be out in the first round of top cut, and suddenly you don't have as much money as you thought you would because you were on a hot streak. It's a little risky for tournament play because of something like that, where that one loss, the one time it breaks out, can be really bad. Yordles in Arms is very solid, but if you are a good player and you are not hard committed to the Ahri Kennen, I feel like Ahri Lulu is a much more skill expressive version of Fizz Lulu. So if you are a good player and you are looking to show off your intricacies with the Flame Chompers interactions, I definitely think that Ari Lulu is the deck that will reward you more for that. But if you're already playing Ari Kennen and you're just looking for the third deck, then Yordles and Arms is a perfectly fine option. But it's not the most skill expressive. You are just kind of playing out your cards, doing what they do, and I just kind of wanted to highlight that. Plunder obviously still sticking around. Lee Sin, little hostile environment for Lee Sin, especially as people continue to look at triple aggro, especially if one of them is going to be fearsome aggro, where your Eye of the Dragons aren't necessarily getting the play that they did. But Lee Sin still feels very good. By the time the seasonal rolls around, unless there is a significant Eye of the Dragon nerf in 5 days, then I imagine Lee Sin will once again be tier 1 by the time the seasonal rolls around. I just really wanted to remove it from tier 1 and highlight the power of the 2 decks at the top right now. So that's kind of why Lee Sin's down in tier 2, but I think this is a solid option that a lot of players are going to go for. A lot of players are very comfortable on Lee Sin. The power level is still very much there, and I don't think it has like any atrocious matchups within the format. I don't think it's doing super great against these two, but for the most part, like, Lee Sin is an unprankable card. Your opponent can't Shellfolk that. It's still coming down on 5. These decks are very light on their removal options, so like the Lee Sin will come down. It's not really going to die. Obviously, you have to worry about like Homecoming in the Ahri decks, but that's not killing your Lee Sin. It's just a matter of surviving before they kill you. But if you are bringing Lee Sin, I imagine that Ahri is the one that you are banning because it is a little bit more elusive focus. The Eye isn't going to do as much for you in this matchup as it is in the Twisted Fate Nami matchup, on top of the fact that Ahri actually has ways to remove the Lee Sin. So that's kind of like, if I were playing this weekend, I'd probably go TF Nami, Ari Kennen, and Lee Sin. Actually, I'd probably go Ari Lulu. That sounds more fun. I think Ari Lulu sounds more fun. And then, Lee Sin. And then I'd ban the Ari decks. That's what I do this weekend. And then we get down into tier 3. These are the things that, like, if it's a comfort pick, it's perfectly viable. You're probably going to, like, see these at some point. Maybe you won't. It kind of depends. There'll be someone in the tournament with these. Spooky Viego. Now that Ari Kennen Go Hard has moved away and the Shadow Isle Ionia region combination is back on the table, Viego is still very much a contender for that spot. I feel like the builds for this are still kind of getting figured out with the new expansion, where it feels like there are definitely some cards in there that people want to be running, but there's not enough, like, Spooky Viego fanatics to really be nailing down the list. But I am confident for this deck, especially if it can get something out of the balance patch, and kind of just come back in a bigger way, maybe move its way back into tier 2. Darkness has a much higher win rate on ladder than I was expecting when I came back and checked it, and you guys know I've always been huge on Darkness. It's fumbled a little bit since the loss of Yordle Explorer with sort of refining what the builds look like, and you're not really outvaluing the Twisted Fate Nami or the Ari Kennen. These decks are just doing very cheap combo-y things, and your mana costs are just a little bit too high to keep up with something like that. But from my understanding, Darkness is doing pretty well into just about anything that isn't these 2 decks. Bandle Pirates, it's getting worse every time. It's worse than Plunder, but you do still have that burn. If you are going for triple burn, Bandle Pirates is still a pretty decent option, especially since you have the Monster Harpoon to try to slow down like the Ari decks or the Namis or things like that. Stony Scout's still a big counter pick, not huge on it, but it's there. Starspring, still a nice counter pick, but again, fringe playability, not doing super well into open fields, much more of a top cut deck, but I do want to highlight that this is something that I think is still very playable in this meta. Scion has really fallen to the wayside, everyone. It's not looking great for Scion out here, and I don't know if that's changing anytime soon. I'd be very surprised if this got buffs. Draven Rebel Burn, though, is something I wanted to highlight. This is... So if you haven't seen this before, I'm taking a look at it for more or less the first time as well, but this looks a lot like what I wanted the Decimate versions of Scion to look like, where when we watch Decimate Scion play, we've run into problems where the players actually really struggle to level Scion unless they find Lost Souls. And we saw it with Squeeby at the seasonal. We've seen it 100 times in tournament at this point, where they just draw like 2 Decimate and Noxian Fervor, and all of a sudden their Scion is coming down with like 6 attack and 20 away from its level up condition. And it just didn't feel cohesive. It didn't feel as good as it did initially. And I'm very optimistic for this Draven Rumble deck to sort of be what we were hoping that Scion deck would be, where all of a sudden, if we don't find Lost Souls, it's not the end of the world. We have a lot of discard. Rumble is doing a much better job of pushing early damage than the Scion is, and we have the might. We can actually level the Rumble fairly consistently. Just 2 attacks and it's done. We don't really mind discarding cards because we have things like Ballistic Bot and these Grenadiers, and it's definitely the best way to put it is that this is what Draven Scion Burn wanted to be, and I'm very big on a deck like this. I just don't know if it's really competing in the meta in a way that I want it to. That's kind of why it's in tier 3. This is like an unknown factor for me, but I am pretty big on this. I'm optimistic for this for sure, and I think this is a great way to round out a triple Decimate lineup if you are looking looking to go the aggro route to counteract the meta and not be as reliant on pushing through like 12 one-drop decks like Pirate aggro and Spider aggro. I think something like Draven, Rumble, Burn, and Vandal Pirates, and maybe another Decimate deck does have a decent shot into the top. But that's completely theoretical. That is 100% theoretical. I haven't even looked at the matchup charts, like I said, because this data is really only good for the one weekend. And then Vandal City Swain doesn't seem to be as favored in the meta as it was before. It's always done very well into things like Yordles and Arms, but as that gets pushed to the wayside for more combo-oriented decks like the Ahri decks, it's just... Vandal City Swain is just not out mid-ranging these decks as well as it has other poppy decks and things like that in the past. So Vandal City Swain, it's sticking around. It is very much like the new TF Swain in my mind, where I don't think we're ever really going to see TF Swain again. I think that BC Swain is the way that we're going to see Swain as the standard from here on out, and I think that's perfectly reasonable. This is just one of those metas where it's not as hip and happening as it was previously, where it was able to counteract the poppy decks and all the Demacia that we were seeing. There's really not like an insane amount of Demacia on this list, especially comparative to what we've seen in the past. It seems that more so our mid-rangey style decks are actually going a little more Piltover and Zon. They're going more Flame Chomper, even like the Draven, Rumble, Burn, and like Scion. Those are Flame Chompers decks. They run Boom Baboon. So that's kind of like my brief overview of the meta. Like I said, a little scuffed, a little bit of a comeback, but I am still Boulevard. I still have my takes. And I like even tier 1. Like I feel like this is a mildly hot take. Put it like separating everything from these two and saying like these are the two top dogs right now. I feel like that's like a mildly hot take. Definitely not spicy, I would say. But yeah. So that's going to do it for the tier list. So there are 2 tournaments that are running this weekend. On Saturday, we have Max Got the Tracks running a $2,500 charity tournament that is going to have a sign-up link in the description below. Today, Friday, is the last day to sign up. You cannot sign up for this an hour before the tournament, from my understanding. Not that I read through it, but that's what I've been told, is that today is the last day to sign up, so you gotta do that. If you're watching this Saturday morning, it's too late. You missed the bit. And then, of course, on Sunday, Mastering Runeterra is returning from a Christmas holiday with their $500 tournament for their $8,000 series, so be sure to sign up for that. So you got 2 big tournaments coming out. If there were no tournaments this weekend, I probably would have taken another week off and not done the tournament Tactician. We would have waited until after the balance patch, but there are 2 massive tournaments, so I did want to come in and give you guys a baseline. Maybe you've been away from Runeterra for the last 2 weeks like I have, just kind of taking a holiday, and then you're like, oh crap, it's, I want to play Runeterra again, what's going on? I know the balance patch is coming up. There's 2 big tournaments, so the signups for both of those will be in the description below, as well as a link to my link tree, which has all of my socials, my Twitter, my YouTube, my Twitch, which is irrelevant, but also has a link to the tier list. So, if you want to hop on that, take a look at this for yourself, click through some of the samples. So that's that. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, especially up until this point. As always, my name is Boulevard, and good luck in your tournaments this weekend. Cannot wait to come back with a balance patch review on Tuesday.